invisible.
Oh my God.
Rather a strange malady.
That's something new. I've not heard that part of the story yet.
I didn't hear that for a long time. I didn't know about it for a long time afterwards. But in any case, those who were on deck, they had a problem because some of them seemed to be insane. Some babbled about ETs. I didn't believe it. And I did not believe about it until I had the paperwork in my hands from Oscar Schneider after he died. He didn't tell me about it. None of them said anything further about what they saw, except they were saying this, and nobody believed it, particularly me. It was up to that point. I had never had a contact with extraterrestrials. I had never seen any on the ship. Duncan, as far as I know, had not seen them. It all occurred in the interim while we were gone from the ship, after we jumped overboard the first time. And then before we came back, the ETs came and went. That's the only way I could piece it together and figure it out later. Because, as the record showed much later, one of them, perhaps many, were implanted by this alien group. One of them, at least, was proven that they were implanted by the records from Dr. Schneider. But I gave my report, and nobody believed it. I did not mention the ET business because I didn't believe it.
Did you ever get to go back and talk with any of the people who were on the ship at that time?
Yes, I did. I definitely did, because we were all back in the Navy Yard. I was essentially pulled off the project, but the project at that point was in limbo. And we talked with the personnel. The Navy didn't know what they wanted to do for quite a while, but I talked with these personnel, talked with some of the ones who they had judged insane, and I didn't think they were insane. I thought they were mentally scrambled, had seen something which the rest of us hadn't seen. And then there were those who were fading in and out of visibility, were literally doing a domain change, if you will, from this reality to another and back. The initial way that the sailors stopped this was for those who were still anchored here permanently, if I may put it that way. I had a laying on of hands. They put their hands on the ones who were fading out, and that seemed to give them the amount of energy they needed to stay in this domain. Later on, they developed electronic equipment to counter this, to solve the problem. And it took 6 months of work.
Where do you think they went?
In an alternate reality. Some went out and never came back. Others were fading back in and out, coming back and forth. It was about 4 or 5 that were doing the fade in and out number.
Did a lot of them die, say, within a year after this?
Yes, within a year to 2 years after, there were quite a few dead. It wasn't a large crew to begin with, but they started dying off. Those that disappeared, did not disappear, started to die off. Now, I remember that the research work involved a number of people in order to try and solve this problem. How do you keep these guys in our reality, in our domain? That work went to a number of people, but one of them I remember specifically because of research long since then. Not that I knew who it was at that time. It was a man by the name of Dr. Royal Rife, who figures in history at a later date as a man who developed the ultra-powerful optical microscope with a magnification of up to 50,000, which is theoretically impossible. I know how he did it, because I figured that out finally. He used a technique which was not thought of at that time, but is valid. It's not direct optical observation, but that's another point. It was optical, but he didn't use a direct view system. He used a rather modified technique. He was also in electronics, and he was involved with a number of things, and I was told, and finally did find out, that a lot of the files regarding what happened at the Philadelphia experiment was in Royal Rife's hands because he worked on the project directly. They pulled in a lot of people. Anyone who they thought might be an expert and could understand what was happening to these sailors, come in and try and solve this problem, see if they could design some hardware which would keep them stable. They did. It took about 6 months, but they did finally design some stabilizing hardware, which Royal Rife was part of. And what basically they were doing was a little black box, if you will, that you put on the guy's belt. This thing would be turned on, and it radiated some kind of a field which kept the guy stable. I do not understand the mechanism in terms of what electromagnetics they were using in terms of what was the biological problem, beyond biology, but what was the actual nature of the problem that they were fading in and out of reality.
So did you, as Ed Cameron, though, have to wear that box?
No, I did not, because I was not affected that way.
Only the people above the deck, right?
Only the people who were above the deck who were directly exposed to the radiations of the hardware, namely the RF fields from the antenna and the electromagnetic, or the magnetic fields per se from the coils which included some electromagnetic component, but basically a magnetic field. The combined effect of those two fields for a couple of hours. How many hours is hard to say, because in terms of 1943 time was about 4 hours. In terms of elapsed time for the others being gone into hyperspace, and the time which Duncan and I spent in 1983, it was approximately 12 hours. Time is flexible, it is not linear, and it can be, shall we say, bent. And under the circumstances of the hyperspace field, it was bent. How long that ship was really in hyperspace is anyone's guess, because you could not measure with a clock. And therefore, those guys were exposed to those fields for quite a long time, and it was almost lethal. Today we know this sort of thing. At that time it was unknown. Only Tesla suspected it, and he suspected quite correctly what the problems might be. So I gave my report. And
I guess you were wondering, where the hell is Duncan?
Yes, I told him that Duncan jumped back overboard and disappeared, and I said I suspect he went back to the future. That's all I could tell him. I didn't know where he went, but that was the obvious and logical conclusion because of what happened the first time.
Were there any other sailors missing?
There's a total of about 6 missing. We know of 5 that were missing totally, that jumped overboard. And they disappeared. Now, why Duncan and I survived the overboard bit is something you can probably spend a lot of time on arguing and never come up with an answer. Our survival apparently was arranged by someone and was for a purpose. The other guys who jumped overboard were not supposed to jump overboard, and whoever was looking out for us didn't look out for them, and they evaporated.
Did they jump overboard after you two jumped overboard?
Yes.
They in a sense following you, right?
They jumped overboard after let us say, the pressure of the field effects that they were being exposed to, and the effects on their minds got to be too much. They jumped overboard just trying to get away from it. As I say, those below decks were not affected, only those on the deck.
But you were still affected for that short while you were above deck to jump overboard.
We would have been affected for a short period of time, but it didn't have enough time element comprised there to cause a major problem, because it took more than 5 or 10 minutes of that kind of exposure. I would estimate about half an hour of exposure before it really started to get to you.
But you were only gone for 20 minutes. The ship was only disappeared for 20 minutes, correct?
And the first test, not the second test. Was 4 hours.
4 hours, I'm sorry, okay.
Which is more than enough time.
Mm-hmm.
We were in the control room until we came out of there, perhaps for 10 minutes, if that much. And then we came out on the deck, and we immediately headed overboard.
Should we now move to your perspective, as you and Duncan are now in the control room?
Okay.
Okay, let's take it from the point where you switch on the equipment, and then what happened from your perspective?
As we switched on the equipment, at first everything functioned in the normal manner, the way I expected it to. And all of the meters, if you will, gave normal readings. And we were there in about 30 seconds into the test when we realized something wasn't quite right. And the reason we realized something wasn't quite right is because all these huge banks of electron tubes. See, the field coils of the 2 alternators were driven by banks of 6L6 tubes. They had to be modulated in a special way, plus the normal drive signals to make the alternator do what it's supposed to do, plus modulate the output signal, required a lot of amplifiers, and it actually took 300 6L6s to drive each one of those coils on each alternator. There were 5 field coils on each alternator. So literally 10 field coils, 300 tubes for each. That's 3,000 6L6 tubes. That's a lot of 6L6 tubes, all glass versions.
And that's a lot of heat.
And that's a lot of heat. And they were not only in our control room, they were in an adjacent room. And as we were looking at this casually, we were seeing something happen, which doesn't happen normally, unless you have an enormous fluctuation in the supply, the heater supply to the heaters. They started to dim and get brighter and get dim and get brighter, and then what the shades is going on here? And then we started to notice something else in the control room. We were starting to get what looked like high voltage arc overs. And there was no high voltage equipment in the control room. There was elsewhere, but not there. And we're seeing this arcing